Hello and welcome to the ShareLife speaker series. My name is Krista Matrenko. I'm here in the ShareLife office. I'm the communications manager at ShareLife. And the ShareLife speaker series is an opportunity to connect those of you who support ShareLife with the wealth of wisdom and knowledge found in the agencies that you support. One of those agencies is Silent Voice. Silent Voice serves deaf adults, youth, children, and their families in an American Sign Language environment. They are dedicated to improving communication and relationships between deaf and hearing family members and deaf and hearing members of the community. Silent Voice is an agency grounded in Catholic values, offering services to the whole community. Now, as you've already noticed, we are offering this speaker series event with ASL English interpretation. And this is the first time that we have done this. Joining us is Adra and Gloria for the interpretation. So we do ask your patience. This is the first time that we have done this. Now, I would like to introduce our two guests. First of all, Kelly MacKenzie. Kelly has been the executive director of Silent Voice since 2012. She has been part of the deaf community for 35 years and is a proficient user of American Sign Language. She is a former ASL English interpreter, and she is passionate about communication and specifically removing barriers to communication. She is an agent of change for the rights of deaf community members. And our second guest today is Mana Bijandgoodarz. Mana has been devoted for over 15 years to Silent Voice. She is working part-time as the volunteer coordinator, but she has also worked in the past as a camp counselor, support worker, supervisor, and mentor. She also works full-time at the Toronto District School Board as support staff and occasionally freelances as a photographer. Mana's goal is to create opportunities for volunteers to develop leadership skills and self-confidence in an ASL environment. She mentors deaf and hard of hearing youth, supporting them in their journeys of self-discovery and realizing their own skills and abilities. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Kelly.
Hello, I'm really thrilled to be here. So I'm going to start with a huge thank you to ShareLife, but to you, the donors to the ShareLife campaign. You support the Catholic charity member agencies, and one of them is Silent Voice. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Silent Voice so that you have a sense of where your generosity goes and the impact that it makes. I'm going to be brief because I really want you to meet Mana. So Silent Voice has been around since 1975. It became a Catholic charity member agency in 1981. It was actually founded by a Catholic priest in the 70s who was noticing that deaf folks, especially deaf kids, were disadvantaged. They were facing barriers. Our very first program was our Sign Language Summer program, which is a camp. So in fact, the camp is older than the agency itself because it started in 74 and we got incorporated in 75. We provide services to members of the deaf community. And members of the deaf community include deaf and hard of hearing infants, children, youth, adults, but also their families. We've been a lifesaver to many families, and we have these amazing testimonials about that. And that's where your generosity goes. We provide an array of services to deaf adults and young and older youth, from general support, and it could be from something fairly simple like a correspondence that somebody's received from the government that they don't understand it, to some real crisis intervention and case management with maybe some other organizations around custody battles or domestic violence. And so the range is huge. We also have a settlement program. And so we offer settlement services to deaf newcomers. And if you can imagine deaf newcomers, because the deaf community is not geographic in nature, so deaf newcomers come from all over the world and use all sorts of different sign languages. So maybe I could dispel some myths. First of all, American Sign Language is not universal. So the sign language that you see the interpreter using right now isn't a universal language. There are hundreds of sign languages in the world. And not everybody that arrives in Canada knows ASL. Some people, some of our clients, ASL in English might be a third or fourth language. But we provide settlement services to deaf newcomers. We also do a free tax clinic. We have a parenting education program, and we have educational programs that cover an array of topics. And it could be from, for example, what's going on in the world with COVID? And if you can imagine the barriers to information and communication around COVID, they were extreme. The isolation experienced by deaf kids and youth, extreme. So Silent Voice played an incredible role in providing access to what's going on. Why are things closed? Why am I wearing a mask? Why am I staying at home? What's going on with my school? And we supported the parents, the families, and the deaf family members. I will say that the number one barrier experienced by deaf individuals is a barrier to information and communication. And I'll introduce a term to you that you may not know. You might know ableism, and that's the discrimination that people with disabilities experience. But autism is the discrimination that deaf people experience. And it really just takes the form of the more hearing you are, the better. So if you use a spoken language and you have hearing aids or cochlear implant and you can function in spoken language, oh, that's so much better. And so it kind of is an oppressive of ASL and deaf community members. So Silent Voice provides an ASL environment, and our children and youth programs are just that. We have a summer camp, and it's an ASL camp. So deaf kids come to a barrier-free camp. Their siblings can come. Hearing family members where there's a deaf family member, maybe deaf parents, they are also invited as well. We run sports. And again, if you can imagine, a lot of our school systems aren't accessible for deaf students to access their extracurricular activities like sports. So we offer sports programs. And I do have this one story that I love to say, and it's about this one young deaf boy who didn't participate in school sports, was kind of told by the school coach, well, how am I going to communicate with you? And so he joined some of Silent Voice's sports programs, and he was a natural at basketball. I mean, a natural. And so he is now on the Canadian deaf basketball team. He's traveled to Brazil and other countries playing basketball. They got the silver medal at the Canada Deaf Games in 2022. And that was because Silent Voice introduced into sports in a really accessible environment in ASL with world-class deaf athletes and incredible mentors. We do a lot of children and youth outreach. So we try to make sure no deaf child falls through the cracks. And again, some statistics. At most, 40% of families that have a deaf family member use sign language in their home. So if you kind of think about it, we're talking about 60% of families that have a deaf child, and there's no real meaningful communication at home. Maybe some superficial stuff, but not, profound homework support or the heritage of that family and the culture and what they celebrate, or discipline, or how was your day? What happened at recess today? The kids invited to a party this weekend. How can you, communicate this excitement? So we have programs where we teach family members, hearing family members, American Sign Language. If you're interested in learning sign language, you can take a course at an agency or a college, but we provide courses to hearing family members of a deaf child so that they can learn to communicate in their home. If you can imagine not having meaningful communication in your home, the impact is profound. And again, these are free services or highly subsidized, and your dollars support our programming. We also provide the Infant Hearing Program, ASL, Language Development Services of the Ontario Infant Hearing Program. And so we are trying to make sure that deaf kids get language before they enter school. And we also have resource development services. So we are developing resources for agencies and websites and partners across Canada to make their information more accessible. We also do a lot of e-education in ASL. And so I'll just back up a bit to say, I'm hearing, I'm not deaf, but I'm one of 3 hearing people in an agency of all deaf people and very consultative. So we really have a nothing about us without us philosophy, and the directors of programs are deaf. The frontline workers are deaf, and our settlement worker is a deaf woman from Ukraine, so that when clients come in, they're like, oh my God, same, we're deaf. Oh, you came from and are going through the immigration system. Wonderful, same as me. And so there's a lot of bonding and safety at Silent Voice for deaf people to come. It's a barrier-free environment, and we break down barriers, and we can't do it without you. So I just want to have my opening and closing remarks to say a profound thank you to you, donors of ShareLife, and Catholic Charities that gives us not only a membership and some funding, but shared services and resources and professional development. So hugely beneficial. But enough about Silent Voice. If you want to find out more, visit our website, www.silentvoice.ca. And if you want to volunteer or learn more about us, everything's there. But really, I want you to meet Manna and hear her story of her involvement in Silent Voice and her journey in life. So really over to Manna, and thank you, Chris, so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me this evening. I do want to talk a little bit, as Kelly said, about my story. I'm the only deaf person in my family. My whole family can hear, and I'm the only deaf person. And being deaf is for sure part of my identity. It's part of my life. But if you sort of think about who a person is, every person is kind of like a puzzle. So there's lots of pieces that come together to make who we are. And for sure, being deaf is part of that puzzle for me. But I've got lots of other pieces to my identity that I've sort of explored and found as I've grown. My parents met. So they're both Persian. Our family comes from Iran, but my parents met in India. They were both in university in India. And my older sister was born in India. Then my family went back home to Iran. And then they moved here to Toronto. And I was actually born here in Toronto and grew up in Toronto. I went to the Metropolitan Toronto School for the Deaf, and they had they had about 150 deaf kids at that school. It was an elementary school, give or take about 150, which is a lot. Lots of deaf and hard of hearing kids, lots of staff that knew sign language. So it was a fully accessible environment in those very early years for me in elementary school. And I enjoyed really being part of that community. It was a really great start for me. My parents, my mom does know some sign language. Signs, I think, good enough, well enough. My dad and sister only know a very little bit amount of sign language. Of course, I love my family very much. I value my connection with them. My extended family, my aunts, uncles, cousins, they don't really sign. They can probably say hello. They might be able to sort of introduce themselves by spelling their name, but it's pretty basic. I really depended on my mom to be sort of the kind of interpreter for me while I was growing up in those early years, because I couldn't really communicate with my family. And so that was a little bit awkward, relying on my mom to do that. And it was pretty limited too. She has her own role in the family. When I was growing up, I was sort of involved with my family, and it was easy in those early years because we were often as kids engaged in activities, and the activities were physical, and you're playing games and doing that kind of stuff. But as I became older, certainly as I became a teenager, I started to find that it was much more difficult to hang out with my family. I was really restricted in how much I could communicate with them. I was communicating in ASL, and they could only communicate using spoken language. And they didn't really know who I was because I started to get into my own personality. I started to find my own personality, and I couldn't communicate that with them. And so they really didn't have a sense of who I was, and I didn't really know who they were. So they could see me, they knew who I was, they could say hello, but they didn't really know who I was growing up to be. When I was at elementary school, if I would miss a day of school, or if I couldn't go to school for some reason, it would be quite upsetting for me. I would beg my parents to send me, regardless of the reason that I couldn't go to school, because it was such a great community, and I really longed to be part of that community. I didn't really want to stay home because at home I was really isolated. I was bored oftentimes. There was nobody around. So my parents would, even on days that were not great weather, they would drive me all the way to school. Because it was sort of my second family. It sort of settled into a real community space at school that I wanted to be around almost all the time, more so than I wanted to be at home. When I was in elementary school, there were a lot of deaf kids around me. When I started high school, there were less deaf kids. I was in an integrated classroom. There was probably about 30 deaf kids in my school. And so there were some teachers who knew sign language, and some signed really well and some not so much. But it certainly was not the same experience as elementary school. It was much more integrated. A lot of hearing people were around. And I sometimes was the only deaf kid in an integrated classroom with an interpreter. And so oftentimes with my peers, they could all hear, they didn't know any sign language. And so it was really hard for me to communicate with them. And the interpreter was there, and I could interpret with, or I could communicate through the interpreter, but it was quite awkward. So I didn't really connect or socialize with my peers. I would often spend time in conversation just with the interpreter because that was the only other person that kind of knew sign language. And to be honest with you, as I started to grow older, I stopped kind of spending time with my family. Like I stopped going to family dinners, stopped hanging out at family events because I was so limited with communication. They didn't use my language. We would sit at the table, for example, for dinner, and I would ask, like, why are people laughing? What are people talking about? And they would always say, well, we'll tell you later. We'll tell you later. We'll tell you later. And I started to become quite frustrated that we would kind of go through this routine. I had family members that were sort of same age as me, and they could hear everything that was going on. But they sort of started to make me feel like in that moment, I wasn't important because I was never told what was going on. I was always being asked to wait. And so I didn't want to rely on my mom to always have to interpret for me at these family events. So I started to kind of disengage with family. When I relied on my mom, I noticed that she was sort of having to do this for me. And so she wasn't being able to be part and play her role in the family. And, sometimes events, families would last 2-3 hours. And I found myself just sort of sitting there, just waiting to get out of there, waiting to want to go home because I was so bored. People would laugh, people would obviously engaging and connecting with each other, but I was not part of that at all. So it really became quite frustrating for me. My family, I felt like wasn't making enough of an effort to engage with me. So I'll give you an example. Like they could have texted with me and they didn't. They could have showed that, they were really interested in learning sign language, but they didn't do that. I just sort of felt kind of ignored. I wanted to sort of see that they were interested in me, wanting to kind of make some kind of motion to sort of be interested, and they weren't. My dad actually, though, had on my dad's side, there were some friends that he had grown up with back home. They were Persian. like my family. And they had kids. But the kids really seemed to be fascinated with sign language. They seemed to really want to connect with me in some way. I was older than they were, but they wanted to learn sign language. And this was sort of the first experience that I had of people kind of my age wanting to engage with me. So they would often kind of learn to spell the alphabet in sign language, and I would teach them the sign. And so I started to spend a little bit of time with these folks, even though they were friends of the family, because I felt like they were trying to make an effort at least to engage me. Sometimes when I would be at family events, we would have a laptop just so that I could kind of keep myself busy. But with these friends of the family, I began to see that they were kind of interested in texting with me and kind of learning some sign language to engage with me in some way. And so I kind of felt connected to that. I spent more and more time with them. We've since lost touch because they've sort of gone their own way. We're in touch very, very rarely, but it was a really nice experience in those days where I really wasn't connecting with others. I really love sports and have been engaged in sports in elementary school and in high school. In high school, I was there's sort of two sections of my high school. So there's the deaf section and the hearing section. And I would sometimes be on the hearing sports teams. And they would sometimes be able to bring in interpreters for those teams, but sometimes the interpreters were not available for practice. So sometimes I had to go without an interpreter. And so I had to work that out, figure out how to be the only deaf person on a team and kind of strategize on how to be part of a team, how to play a sport with people who don't use the same language. And so I would kind of teach a bit of sign language to my teammates, to my coach, right back and forth. There were some folks that would be interested in learning ASL. So that kind of, sort of gradually started to take shape. And if interpreter was there, great. And if interpreter was not there, we sort of made do in those days. My coach really tried to engage me and communicate with me. The assistant coach also writing back and forth, making sure that I got all the information that I needed to really be part of the teams that I was playing on. So that was a really nice experience. I felt quite included. And at the time too, as I was growing, I didn't really know how to advocate for myself. I really relied on my mom when I was young, and I didn't really learn those advocacy skills as I was growing into a young adult. When I finally graduated high school, I started post-secondary college, and tons of barriers, no interpreters available oftentimes at college. I remember going for the first 3 weeks and sitting in 2 or 3 hour lectures with absolutely no idea what was happening. There was sometimes a person that would agree to watch or agree to take notes rather, but I would just sort of sit there and kind of stare at somebody talking, and I never understood what was going on, like in my classes that I was in. And again, I didn't know that I could kind of move towards getting an interpreter, and I had a right to get an interpreter, and that I could kind of advocate for myself. I really didn't know. So I decided to leave college. It was not really beneficial. And at the same time, I was kind of starting to, grow as a young adult. And I had that early experience of being really part of a community when I was in elementary school, less so in high school, and then really less so, really diminished in college and post-secondary. And I kind of was feeling by the time I hit post-secondary that I was kind of like, whether I was at post-secondary, I was with my family, I was feeling isolated. Like I just didn't really have opportunities to connect with people. And again, I really love my family. I want folks to know that I know they tried their best to support me, but I couldn't connect with them. I did, though, have some friends, some good friends, and I felt really connected to my friends. I felt like they were sharing what they were learning with me, and I was sharing what I was learning as we were all sort of merging into young adulthood. But with my family, I never felt that kind of real bond, which was really hard. And that sort of led me to Silent Voice and my first job with Silent Voice. I started as a camp counselor. And as soon as I started with Silent Voice, I started to learn a ton of stuff about myself and a ton of skills. I learned right away that I love kids. I started working with kids that some of them signed really well. Some of them were just learning to sign. The staff signed all the time. And it brought me back to that sort of feeling of being in elementary school when I was part of a community. I felt like at Silent Voice, I was part of a community again, with the staff, with the kids that we were working with, and I started to develop those connections and relationships. So I really started to work on developing my skills as a person that was beginning their work life. I started to get some tech skills, some administration skills. Obviously, when COVID hit, the pandemic hit, I learned a ton of stuff around tech and how to transition on into a tech world. I work at the Toronto District School Board, as was mentioned in my biography. So I work there, and I also work with Silent Voice. And I noticed that as soon as the pandemic hit, a lot of the kids, and I remember it was in March when the pandemic hit, and then right after March break, it was announced that, you know, kids could not go back to school. And so I thought about all of those kids that were deaf and hard of hearing and now all of a sudden stuck in their homes. And I really kind of empathized with them because I knew what it was like to grow up in a home where your parents can't communicate with you, or the communication is really limited, and you don't have any connections, you don't have any contacts. And so as a team at Silent Voice, we decided to set up right away a homework club for those kids and connect with them online. So we got that together, and we got it together in a small way. And we could see already that kids were really needing extra support, these deaf kids that were sort of in their homes on their own. And so we started to work with them to catch them up on their work that they were supposed to be doing at school. But it wasn't just about homework. It was also about kind of working with these kids to think about responsibility, to show up and to be making sure you're checking your email, to communicate with your teachers, to make sure you're showing up to the homework club. And so teaching them about responsibility, teaching them about independence, because this is stuff that they wouldn't necessarily have access to in their own homes. And then since the pandemic has sort of dissipated, we're still continuing on with those homework clubs because they've been a huge success and a really great lifeline for a lot of those kids. So I've sort of in the interim learned about all of this kind of tech stuff and kind of been a bit more tech savvy. I actually have always had an interest in technology. But sort of dealing with being online and having to reach out with kids online, I think, and figuring out activities for kids online, all of that has been a huge learning curve for all of us, myself included. But it's been a wonderful opportunity for me and for all of the kids that are involved. They come to Silent Voice on online programs, they do crafts, they do activities, games. And we also have ASL that we do. So we've got kids that, for example, that may know sign language, some kids that don't know sign language. For kids that know sign language, they might need some time to sort of sit and chat and connect with someone because they can't do that at home. And so we'll spend some time doing that with those kids. And then sometimes we work with kids that have a little bit of sign language, but they need to improve their language skills. So I'll sit with them and kind of expose them to more sign language, more pieces of our culture, deaf culture, and start to build some of those foundations that they might necessarily not have access to. And so that's a really good opportunity for those kids as well. And then online, they can connect with each other. Sometimes they don't really have the means to connect. A lot of kids at home, they might not even have their own phone, so they can't connect with their own peers. So this is an opportunity for them to come online and do that with us at Silent Voice. For me, I also feel like I've had to contribute to Silent Voice because I've gotten so much from them. And so one of the ways I contribute is do presentations like this. And I really sort of value my contributions to them. I love to do photography, so I've done a little bit of that for Silent Voice. I've also learned not to really rely on interpreters to sort of showcase my own skills. And I'm actually going to show you some pictures of some of my work. Yeah, so these are some of, so I do some freelance photography work. And so we've done some winter scenes. And so again, just offering some free service to the clients of Silent Voice and the families and some of the youth. So this is an opportunity for them to get some professional shots. Again, I'm volunteering my time for Silent Voice to do this. And I bring in all of my equipment, my props, all of that kind of stuff. And give the families the opportunity to get some professional photos done. And then we print them as well. And families are so elated when they get these kinds of pictures. They could not afford to get actual professional photos done in sort of the mainstream. And so it's really great so that I've been able to use my technical skills, things that I've learned from Silent Voice to kind of contribute back to clients. And you can actually see the cherry blossoms there in the background. And so for me, for the next piece for me is I'd like to start to build some props. And I've been talking about this with the team at Silent Voice around building things that clients need, things that the kids might need, and then again, contributing these things and doing these things with the kids so that I'm kind of learning and building my skills, but also contributing to Silent Voice and doing things that, you know, like this photography piece here. The next thing that I'd really like to do is to empower some of our youth at Silent Voice, some of our clients, some of the older kids, to really sort of empower them to use their own creativity, find their own voices around what they like to do. So giving them things that they need, kind of setting up a budget around what they're going to need to do their activities or kind of follow what they want to do in terms of their goals, getting them the equipment that they need so that they can really sort of explore the kinds of things that they might like to do, because you never know where you might end up as a career, as a job. So it's really important to kind of explore these hobbies for these young kids. So these are the kinds of different things that I've done in Silent Voice. You can see some of the stuff that I've been involved in as a volunteer coordinator. As a volunteer coordinator, incidentally, that's helped me a lot develop my own skills around advocacy skills for myself, for the deaf community, and really grow my own skills, my own sort of sense of abilities, what I'm able to do, what I'm able to contribute to my own community. And it's given me an opportunity to get to know myself a bit better, to sort of see the kinds of gifts that I have, you know, and kind of continue on that puzzle that I spoke with. There was a lot of missing pieces as I grew up as a person, just not knowing who I was because I wasn't connected enough to the world. And so Silent Voice has given me an opportunity to explore that. And I really love being a role model for some of the younger kids coming into Silent Voice now. And I love getting feedback from the staff. So they give me lots of feedback, critical feedback on how to get better. I love engaging with hearing people as a deaf person, trying to figure out how do you communicate with hearing people? How do you kind of share what each culture knows? How do you kind of connect with each other? I'm actually going to be presenting at the AGM, the annual general meeting for Silent Voice, as part of sort of taking on new challenges. And I'm super nervous about the whole thing. But again, this is me kind of growing. Yeah, so it's also, you know, learning about Zoom, learning about presenting. So for me, that's where I sort of get lit up. I know about Zoom, but this is the sort of first time I've had a chance to do a webinar. So it's more and more learning. I do want to show a video. I've been involved with the Toronto FC. So I want to actually show a video of some of the work we've been doing with Toronto FC. So here you go. So this is, you know, again, huge audience. We're in a huge stadium. So really scary for me. I had major stage fright doing this, but we've been able to be on the field. And it's been such an opportunity. It comes from Silent Voice, being able to be on the field, giving the national anthem in sign language. So it's been amazing. And here I am tonight presenting for you folks. So this has been such a huge growth experience for me, and that's thanks to Silent Voice. So thank you for having me tonight.
There we go. So we did have a number of questions, and I should have mentioned from the very beginning that if you want to ask your questions, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A that's going to be at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to all of your questions. Should have mentioned that from the beginning. I do have some questions before we get to those for both Kelly and Mana. The very first question is about effectively all of our audience is here because of ShareLife. They are people who support ShareLife, and many have been doing so for years and years. The 2023 ShareLife Parish campaign is underway. Our first Share Life Sunday is March 26th. What does their generosity to Share Life mean for the work that Silent Voice is doing, Kelly?
Thanks, Chris. Well, I will say that we don't charge for our services. So there's not a fee for service, except for a really small fee, highly subsidized fee for our camp and our family communication program of ASL instruction. And when I say small, I mean small. And so the generosity of ShareLife donors supports our programs. They support kids having barrier-free access to peers and mentors, and quite frankly, hope and inspiration and their future. We have stories from teachers in September that they tell us that they know which kids went to the summer camp in the summer and which didn't, because they were so engaged, so turned on. They learned so much from the deaf mentors like Manna when she was a counselor, and were so inspired to achieve things that they were raring to go in September. And they knew the campers, the students that were not engaged in the summer and maybe quite isolated and experienced, their iPad a great deal in the summer. So we know we're on the right track. And I will say, so that's the camp, but the family communication program, when I talk about the lack of communication in the home, and Manna talks about her personal experience, like some people don't know just how profound that really is. We've had some campers that have come to the camp with really no language. They haven't developed it on their own. They haven't had peer connections. And their parents don't sign. And they come into our camp or our Saturday program, and they've learned from the counselors and the peers that are there and just flourished. I have one mom that said, my child couldn't put two signs together, like two word sentences, so to speak, before camp. And after, a few weeks of camp, was coming home with stories, like full stories, not just sentences, but stories about what happened at camp that day. So we know that the impact is incredible, and we can't run a camp without you guys. And as you know, the cost of living has gone up. The price of gas has gone up. We cover transportation to and from the camps. We have activities and field trips. We want it to make it an exciting, fun learning opportunity. And I've said this before at other presentations, that we learn so much through fun. So when kids are at camp, when they're participating in sports, when they're playing with mentors and peers, they learn so much. Really basic social skills like cooperation, turn taking, being a team member. And it's all through fun. So they don't really even know that they're learning. It's not like a lecture. And so we're developing these life skills and social skills that they're actually not getting at home. And Manna mentioned COVID, and we were able to give language to what was going on in the world to deaf kids that didn't understand what was happening, and their parents didn't have the language to explain it. So you donors to the ShareLife campaign make a huge difference. You impact people's lives. We can't do what we do without you. I hope that answers the question, Chris. My sincere gratitude always.
Absolutely. It definitely answers the questions, Kelly. Thank you. I have a question for Manna now. I think it's safe to say that everybody who is participating in this webinar wants to be an ally of the deaf community. Many of us don't have friends or family members who are deaf, however. And so what would you say does it mean for us to be an ally for the deaf community? What are some tips for how we can do better? I'm sure you experience well-meaning individuals who might provide sources of encouragement or might be inadvertently causing frustration. What would you say to us?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for that question. So I would say that when you're asked to, for sure, try to provide access and try to make it equitable access. That's really important. And to try and be inclusive. If somebody asks for an interpreter, for example, respect that choice. Don't just say, you know, and some people might be okay with writing back and forth, but some deaf folks would not have English as a language that they can use. So they prefer to work with an interpreter just to prevent any misunderstandings. So if they're asking for something, support what they're asking. Be really invested in working with them. And really sort of provide, you know, if you're seeing something that's happening that isn't right, and it's something that's happening to a deaf person, say something, speak up on behalf of our community. If you see that someone's unwilling to provide access for us, it's okay to take our side and to say, actually, that's actually not okay to do. And to sort of speak to your counterpart in the community to say, actually, this person does have a right to access. So those are some ideas.
I have a follow-up to that. I'm wondering, particularly in the religious context, what areas in what areas should faith communities be doing better? How can we better advocate for the deaf community in the religious context? What are some gaps that we might not be aware of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on who's doing the asking, the family, for example, the parishioner, for example, that's doing the asking or that needs. I guess I'll ask you, I do want a moment to think about it, but perhaps just in terms of exactly, like, can you give an example?
Well, I guess one way of putting it is our religious services, is it easy to find religious services that provide ASL interpretation? I guess is one very, very basic need that I'm sure is out there.
Yeah, okay. So I think certainly I would say you sort of echo what I said before, which is that if a family or a person, a deaf person, is asking to be part of a religious service and they want an interpreter, that you would book one, and that the parish would take care of that. And so if they're advocating for that would be respected, that they would have you know, access to their service, their mass, etc. And I know that Kelly wants to add, so I'll defer to her. Yeah, so the Archdiocese of Toronto does actually have a church where deaf folks go to, and it's an accessible mass, which is amazing. So that there are deaf folks that who are connected to their faith, they can go into an accessible mass. They don't just wander into a church, sit in a pew, and really have no access to what's happening in terms of the service. Some children you know, will say to us that they wish their mass was more accessible. They often go with their parents. They get dragged with their parents, but they don't understand what's happening. And so if parents don't sign, there's not really sort of a connection there in terms of how they're able to pass that faith on to their children. So that's really, really tricky. So if deaf children are going to mass, it's really important that mass is accessible to those deaf children. But there are in the Archdiocese of Toronto pockets where deaf people do assemble and do have opportunities to take part in an accessible mass. And I will say that when deaf folks come together in that way, they're coming actually together. It's not just one deaf person at a parish here and another deaf person at a parish there. They're actually coming together as a community and celebrating their faith as is meant to happen. They, take part in religious events together, and they're sort of together as a community. Mena? Yeah, I'll just add to what Kelly is saying that to sort of be involved, and so whatever is happening, if there's an interpreter that's being requested, that's being honored, I think is a really important thing. And if you do know that deaf people are part of your congregation, or if deaf children are part of your congregation, and you're a parishioner, offer that, speak up to, the parish priest around getting that person an interpreter. I know that sometimes people will go in, and this has been my experience as well, that we're often taken to these kind of events that are part of our tradition, are part of our faith, but no one ever kind of speaks up to say, actually, these kids have a right to access. So I would really say that if you see that's happening in your parishes, to please speak up and say, this child has a right to access this mass, and get them to book an interpreter. So again, the whole idea is that you come to kind of speaker series like this, and you sort of say, okay, well, there's deaf people here and there's interpreters here, and the magic happens in that way. But if you're seeing that's happening in your communities where there aren't accessible places, to really speak up to that. And so I think sometimes parents don't want to over ask for too much stuff, or they might not even know that their kid has a right to have access to an interpreter during a mass, for example. But as community members, it really is our job to kind of speak up for those people. So, and it's no matter what kind of access you need, it really is on the organization to provide access, and that includes faith-based organizations. And when you're booking an interpreter, you don't have to make sure that interpreter is booked, every single day for every single thing. But when someone is asking for an interpreter, you should for sure honor that request.
And I can add that we do ShareLife presentations in parishes, and deaf people go out for the ShareLife campaign to talk about silent voice and their stories, and we have interpreters, and ShareLife supports the access for those presentations because it's so vital, and so we're able to be out in the churches to give the same kind of story. So we really do want to put faces and stories and names to your support. You write a check or you put money in an envelope, but what we really want you to know is that it has real human impact.
There was a follow-up question here. Where can I attend a deaf mass in Toronto? I don't necessarily expect that that either of you would necessarily know the specific details. If you do, by all means, speak up. But this is something that when we share the video from this presentation with all of our registered attendees, we can include that information in the email there.
Yeah.
One question that I think applies to both Mana and Kelly: what are the volunteer opportunities with Silent Voice? We have a participant here who wants to get involved with the deaf community, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, I guess over to me. I'm the volunteer coordinator, so I guess I'll answer. So on our website, there's a number of ways to get engaged with Silent Voice. Kelly talked about all of the programs, so you have to sort of indicate your interest and your time, your availability. And then you can actually come in person to volunteer, or you can volunteer your services online. So we have a questionnaire, and you sort of, some of the programs that we offer are online. So you go through the sort of questionnaire. We'll take you through a short interview, and then kind of off you go with the process. And I hope we see some volunteers. That would be really great. I'm excited to meet new people. So that'd be great.
Can I just add, Chris, that one of our board members is one of the superintendents at a Catholic school board, because we did a ShareLife presentation to her family of schools. And she was so taken with silent voice and the deaf presenter that she volunteered and sits on our board of directors.
Related question from one of our participants here. Do you need to know sign language to volunteer? Do you need to be coming with any prior experience?
So there are opportunities. You don't have to be a fluent signer. There are opportunities to engage with the organization. You will certainly learn sign language once you start volunteering. So it's a really good opportunity to grow your skills in that area, if that's what you're interested in doing.
Awesome. Another question here. This person writes, Mena, thank you for sharing your inspiring story. I learned so much from you and your story. Can you teach us some basic sign language that you think is the most important?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Good question. So hello would be a good one. Here's hello. Or you can even wave. So that's a sort of more casual. So there's the former hello and then the hi. Sorry, this is the sign for sorry. Yeah, that's a good one to know. Thank you. This is the sign for thank you. Now, it's the chin. It's this part of the chin that the hand is moving forward. That's important. So thank you. Please. This is the sign for please. So sorry is the closed fist and please is an open hand. See that? That's important to distinguish those two. Welcome. So you're welcome. Yeah. I think that's enough, I think, for today.
I know that there's a lot of additional resources on Silent Voice's website as well. I've been following your social media channels and seeing lots of interesting tips there on how to become a better ally for the deaf community. I think that's all the questions. Oh, we have one more question here. Actually, it's more of a comment. It says here, there is a website under deaf in the okay, so I'm just trying to read this here. So there is a mass listing, I believe on the Archdiocese website, an ability to contact the coordinator for deaf ministry, who can help, I guess, connect people with a deaf mass for them. The coordinator of the deaf ministry, her name is Carol Stokes, and so we can provide that contact information in the email that we'll be sending to registered participants as well. So that's all of the questions that we have. Really want to thank all of our participants
before you do your
for
close,
joining us.
Chris,
Oh, yes.
I'm going to interrupt for just a moment. Before you do your close, I just want to add a little thing before.
Please do.
For folks who do actually want to learn sign language, because there seemed like there was some interest in doing some basic sign language, I can always I mean, I don't know if for the purposes of the recording, excuse the interpreter, it took me a moment there. For the purposes of the recording, if we want to do a few more signs, because we've got a few more minutes left, just for the purposes of the recording, if people want to kind of just on the recording, get a few more signs in, if that's of interest.
Absolutely, let's do it. And this is going to be going up on YouTube, so people will be able to play it back, stop it, and so please, by all means. Okay.
So if there's particular signs, I'm happy to just model those, and that way they'll be on. I don't know if our audience members have any particular signs. And Kelly, perhaps Mena, you can share nice to meet you. So if you meet, this is from Mena, if you meet a deaf person, so it's nice to meet, see that, meet. So imagine that this is the form of two people meeting, you. Okay, so I'm going to do it again. Nice to meet you. Okay. And if there's a couple of others, we'll get them in. And Kelly is feeding. How are you? Yeah. So some people will sign it. How are you? So how are you? Or this way. You good? That's a bit more casual. You good? So in ASL, you can see that the grammar is quite different from English. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways. So are you good? So again, we're looking at the grammar of ASL, which is going from how's it been going lately? And Kelly is saying, can you talk about ASL not being the same languages? And Mena is saying, sure. So how are you is the proper grammar for English. In ASL, we do not use English grammar. So there are lots of pieces of English grammar that we do not use, and we substitute those things for other things. We look at the language in 3D, and so the language doesn't exist in a linear form like it does in English. And so oftentimes, and I apologize to the interpreters, because sometimes you'll see a deaf person sign a couple of signs, and in English it takes a couple of sentences. So ASL is, the way we communicate is quite different from English. Some people are using signed exact English or more sort of English forms of sign language. But that's quite different from American Sign Language, which has its own grammar. But again, it's a lot more visual. It's a lot more concise than English is. And I said 3D, but I think maybe it's probably 4D actually. I think that'd be cool if it was 4D, but it's a much more visual language, as is pretty obvious. So yeah, quite different from English.
That's wonderful, Mena. I thank you so much for sharing this knowledge, for sharing your story with us. I think that we all learned a lot. To Kelly, the mission of Silent Voice is beautiful. We're really proud as part of the ShareLife team to support what your organization is doing. And thank you for sharing that with us and for sharing your heart with us for breaking down these barriers. And I hope that all of us in the audience can be a part of that, part of breaking down these barriers. I did want to remind everyone that ShareLife Sunday is March 26th. And one of the ways that you can support Silent Voice is through your generosity to ShareLife. And I also would like to remind you that we will be sending this video to everyone who is registered. So if you happen to miss the start of it, don't worry, you'll be able to see the whole thing. It will be up on our YouTube channel, and we'll be linking to it on our social media channels. We also encourage you to follow Silent Voice on their social media channels. That's everything for tonight. Again, for those of you who joined us, thank you so much. God bless and have a great night.
Thank you, Chris.